welcome everyone to the Western Port Woodlands Wildlife or Sandpit report launch. Thank you very much for joining us all this evening. I would like to start with an acknowledgement of country and to acknowledge the many First Peoples of the area now known as Victoria, and we honour their continuing connection to country. The report, of course, is on the land of the Bunurong people, so we'd like to pay our respects to those folks as well. So we're very excited to be able to launch this report tonight. A huge amount of work has gone in, done by consultants, ecologists, the VMPA, and of course the Save Western Port Woodlands group, and many others who have supported. So for those of you who may be not familiar with this area, just to give you a bit of an idea of where this area is, because we know that we've got people joining from around the state here. It is the corridor between Lang Lang and Grantville, and it is the corridor between Lang Lang and Grantville, and it's that strip of bushland that you can pass on the way to Phillip Island and the prom that you'll see on the South Gippsland Highway. And it is home to a huge array of threatened species, including southern brown bandicoots, the powerful owl, the weird but wonderful tea tree fingers, the only species of fungi listed under the state's FFG Act to be found in this location, as well as a group of threatened orchid species. Let's welcome to the stage our VMPA duo, where we're going to kick off with Matt Ruckle, followed by Jordan Crook. And Matt is going to start with giving you a bit of an intro into the work VMPA does and why this issue and protecting this critical area in Victoria is really important.
I'd just like to say how very pleased the VMPA have been to work with Save the Woodlands group, who've been running a great local campaign. We commissioned this report at least 12 months ago. So we're a community organisation. We're dependent on sort of supporters and membership for a lot of our work. We do sort of three areas of activity, and they intertwine in a way. We do nature conservation, advocacy, citizen science, and nature activities and information. Some of you may. So in terms of our advocacy work, we cover a broad front. As our name suggests, parks and parks protection and management are key issues. And you'd be surprised, even if you've got the highest level of legislative protection, how often people are trying to either build inappropriate things in them, change the legislation, and also we need to work hard to ensure that the resources are there so that they're managed properly. That's always a bit of a challenge. There's never enough. We also work on new parks, so completing the reserve system, and we had a recent announcement for new parks in the central west of Victoria, so that's filling gaps in the reserve system and protecting those parks into the future. There's still a bit of a way to go on that to complete those. They still need to be legislated and so on. But yes, so after a sort of good solid 5 to 10 years work. Marine and coastal, so we're one of the few peak groups who work on marine and coastal issues, and all of you will be probably aware, if you're locals, that we work with other colleagues, Environment Victoria and local groups around Western Port Bay, and we're very pleased to see the announcement last year that the AGL proposal was rejected. We also do lots of work on habitat and threatened species and forests and woodlands right across the state. And this work around the Western Port corridor is a bit of a mix. So it's a little bit about ensuring the integrity of the existing reserves, which aren't national parks, but they're nature conservation reserves and other types of protected areas. So they're part of the protected area estate. There's lots of habitat and threatened species, and they're also woodlands. So it ticks quite a few boxes for us. One of the things we do in our conservation work is every decade or so, a lot of this is informed by science. We do a major review. What are the priorities over the long term? And if we flick to the next slide, Jordan, one of the things, and this is one way of looking at it, the Gippsland Plain, where these woodlands are placed, are one of the more cleared bioregions, or one of the most cleared bioregions in the state. And if you dig a bit deeper, they've also got not a lot of public land. And often the trend in Victoria is that there's higher biodiversity or more intact patches of bush on public land. Doesn't mean necessarily there's not more threatened species on private land, but the big patches tend to be public land. So there's less of that in the Gippsland Plain, and it also sort of falls under appropriate targets, national, state and international targets for benchmarks for protected areas. So the Gippsland Plain jumps up as a bit of a priority. And the more we started to dig and look, triggered a bit by the Holden Proving Ground sale and the good campaign from the locals, became very interested in the string of parks along here and their very important values. So that's just a bit of a sense of sort of what we're about and why we're involved. And I'll now like to hand over to Jordan. Jordan has been working with the VNPA for the last year or so, and he's everybody's a nature conservation campaigner in the VNPA, but he's had over a decade of experience in particularly forestry advocacy, forest work and conservation advocacy. He's got a qualification in conservation and land management. It's a qualified arborist. But I'd also say about Jordan, he's very passionate about trees. He's very passionate about nature. He's done most of the legwork on producing this report and getting a sort of joint campaign underway. So I'll hand over to you, Jordan, to talk about a bit about the content. But again, thank you very much. And well done to our partners in getting us this far, at least with this report. Now we need to make sure we can push it along.
So yeah, welcome to everyone to the launch of our report. Thanks for coming along, and also like to acknowledge traditional owners of the country where I am, of the Wurundjeri people, the foothills of the Dandenong Ranges here. Everyone probably kind of knows the Western Port Woodlands without actually knowing the Western Port Woodlands. As Shannon said, down the South Gippsland Highway and down the Bass Highway, you'll bump into these stretches of bush. So we got qualified ecological consultants to have a look at the area and look at the records of threatened species, threatened ecological vegetation classes through the area. We assess the threats to the area, which you can see in this image is quite distressing, which is sand mining. And we also reviewed the different types of land tenures in the area. So this is what it's like. The sand is very close to the top, and unfortunately that makes it very, very vulnerable to sand mining. So as Matt said before, I just kind of started at the VNPA when the Holden Proving Ground site went up for sale. As a kid, I used to go down to Venus Bay quite a lot and used to drive past the very heavily fortified Holden Proving Ground site and wonder what's going on in there and what type of burnouts, etc. they're doing in their new cars. But as I got older, I got to understand it was a very good piece of native vegetation, and you'd hear rumours of bandicoots and really good high quality vegetation in the area. So when this opportunity came up, it definitely pricked our ears and really was a really good opportunity at the time, which has luckily also come back onto the market. So the opportunity presents itself again. It was also pushed by the wonderful local group down there, the Save Holden Bushlands group at the time, but there'd been a campaign since the 1990s to protect these areas, and the wonderful Meryl Tobin, who's in that article there, helped out very heavily with the report and got the VMPA to start moving on the protection of the Western Port Woodlands. Here's the wonderful Save Holden Bushlands group who formed very quickly. It was a very quick transaction, unfortunately, but the site's been put back on the market by the current owners, so opportunity still lives. So this is the corridor, and I guess the Western Port Woodlands, it's all about context, as Matt was talking about. It's in the Gippsland Plain bioregion, one of the most cleared bioregions in the most cleared state in Australia. So this semi-intact and quite largely intact up around the Holden Proving Ground area stretch of native bushland is very important for animals like the southern brown bandicoot, the long-nosed bandicoot, the powerful owls that are still existing in those areas. And as you zoom out, you really get to know the context and how little bush there is in the area and how heavily fragmented it is and how important that Holden Proving Ground site is in the corridor of native vegetation for the Western Port Woodlands. So with the ecological consultants, Hayley, Connor and Robert, shout out if you're out there. Thank you for all your work on this amazing report. We used records from the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, as well as the Atlas of Living Australia, which are two databases where people can log sightings of any species, but we zoned in on the threatened species, those listed on the federal Commonwealth legislation, as well as the State Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. And as you can see in the green there is the actual protected areas, and then everything else is not protected. So a large protection of the percentage of the corridor is not actually protected, which is quite concerning for the wildlife. So you wouldn't think much steaming past the Western Port Woodlands on your way to the Prom or Phillip Island that there's much going on in there. It is dotted with the sand mines, but those bushlands are home to some really extraordinary species, such as the powerful owl, Australia's largest owl species. It needs the large hollow bearing trees to live and roost and rear young. And as you can see, there's about 21 threatened species that call the corridor home. There's a wide range of species, from the giant earthworm to the swift parrots that fly back from Tasmania to powerful owl. But there's also some really outlying populations of animals that aren't threatened yet. You've got koalas naturally occurring in the area. You've also got southern long-nosed bandicoot, which got hit pretty hard after the 2019 and 2020 bushfires. And there's also mountain brush-tailed possums, or bowbucks, out there as well. So as you can see, they're not coming in from anywhere else. That little patch of vegetation is very much an island out there. So they've held on in this area for so long. It's time to look after their habitat. So a lot of the time we kind of skim over the plants and the fungi, but the corridor is an amazing botanical site. To go there in spring, there's orchids and wildflowers popping up everywhere, and there's this strange fellow on the side here, which is the tea tree fungus, which is only found in a handful of locations in Victoria, and quite a few of those populations are in that corridor around the Gerties and around Adams Creek. So it's a small fungi, grows on tea trees, banksias and kunzia, but it's the only fungi species listed on the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. So it's quite an important little indicator of health in the environment. And then on the other side, you've got the majestic and massive Strzelecki gums. So from the big to the small, the corridor is very important. And as you can see, the list of threatened species in the corridor is important, and all these get knocked out when sand mining happens. And even the best bushland manager and restoration ecologist couldn't put back remnant vegetation the way it already is. The best remnant vegetation is the stuff that already exists. You can't replant what's currently there. So we're zooming in on the Holden Proving Ground site, the heart of the woodlands. You've got the Lang Lang Education Area, which is a piece of public land which has records of southern brown bandicoots and long-nosed bandicoots. And then the Holden Proving Grounds, a few different sites. A few of the back end blocks, as you'll read in the report, were actually public land that we handed over to Holden back in the day. But you can also see quite a few records of different species there. Those being swift parrot, strzelecki gums, a few of the different types of orchids as well. So, and you see the species on one end and the other end. There's animals and plants obviously moving through that landscape. We've also got very not very common ecological vegetation classes, or EVCs. You could just, they're different types of habitats really. So and down that way there's quite a few different rare kind of EVCs. Obviously the area was so heavily cleared, what's left is going to be pretty rare, but there's one or two endangered EVCs within the Holden Proving Ground that still exist. So we're very lucky to still have those. That's the riparian heathy woodland, I'm pretty sure. So yeah, important site, not just for the plants and the animals, but the whole lot, the community together. So this is one of the disappointing findings of the report. The lack of protection of the remnant vegetation in the area, and thus the threatened species habitat. So the consultants found only 1% of the area within the corridor is covered by environmental significance overlays, which are applied by councils, and they are kind of like the first stop of protection when planning or developing an area. And it's quite disappointing that the Holden Proving Ground and that string of vegetation through that area doesn't have environmental significance overlays, as we see in the amount of threatened species, plants and animals, and vegetation types, but it can't even get that basic ESO placed over it. So that would be a great start for these woodlands to get that bottom line kind of level protection. So the report is quite big. It's about 66 pages or so, and the ecologists came to a few recommendations, and we worked with the Save Western Port Woodlands group that grew out of the Save Holden Bushland group, and the recommendations are pretty simple. So there's quite a lot of work authorities for mining in the area. One of the main things we need to do is to stop granting those licenses on native vegetation. If we want to maintain the integrity of the corridor, we need to do that. It would be great to have a VAC or VAC-like investigation of the area to better understand, protect the natural and cultural values of the area, and to understand which blocks are public land and which aren't, and moving forward and protecting those. Long-term vision, just like back in 1996, the Bass Coast National Park, really strengthening the protection of the existing reserves and adding to them, and help secure long-term protection for the bushland sites and the plants and animals that call them home. So at all levels of government have got a role to play with protecting the corridor. So local councils could start putting environmental significance overlays, say that 5 times quickly, over the high value conservation areas, the woodlands and native vegetation in their areas. And then the big one, now that it's back on the market, would be for local councils and state government to work towards acquiring the Holden Proving Ground and opening it back up to the public and adding it to the protected areas estate. Thank you to all the partners who helped, Save Western Port Woodlands, all the wonderful photographers who lent us their photos, and to the locals for taking us around these sites, understanding the impacts of the mining, where all the beautiful wildflowers are, and to the consultants and the folks at the VMPA for helping get this report up and out. And we hope it can really help make a difference and protect that corridor from Lang Lang to Grantville.
Thank you, Jordan and Matt. As you can see, an incredible amount of work went into the report. And, you know, showcasing the area's incredible natural values. And just like you were saying, Jordan, trying to say the environmental significant overlays really, really quick. Imagine trying to say tea tree fingers, fungi really, really quick over and over again. I'll introduce Megan, our fourth speaker for the evening. So Megan is a project officer at the Cardini Environment Coalition.
So first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking to you from today, the Wurundjeri people, and the traditional owners of the lands which the Cardini Environment Coalition operate, the Bunurong people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. The Cardini Environment Coalition was formed in 1998 to protect and enhance the natural environment in Cardinia Shire. Our purpose is to facilitate the building of interest about environmental matters in the community and facilitate the building of capacity in the community to act in ways that enhance or protect the natural environment, to make representations to Cardinia Shire Council and other relevant authorities on environmental issues, to provide individual and community education on environmental issues, and to support environmental networking and collaboration between environment groups. The CEC run an Indigenous nursery supplying locally native plants to the community, environmental groups, government agencies and other organisations. The CEC also manages 7 parcels of public land. Some of these we're revegetating from degraded pasture, some are high quality remnant vegetation that we're protecting from invasive weeds, and some we're doing feral animal control on. So if you're interested in learning more about the Cardini Environment Coalition or helping us look after the local environment, please have a look at our website and get in touch. So the northeast section of the Western Port Woodlands Wildlife Corridor falls within Cardinia Shire. It's an important area for threatened species, with recent records of the green-striped greenhoods, which are listed as vulnerable under federal legislation and endangered under state legislation. Lace monitors listed as endangered under state legislation. Large-leaf cinnamon wattles endangered under state legislation, and southern brown bandicoots, which are endangered under both federal and state legislation. Part of this area is remnant vegetation on private property adjacent to Adams Creek Nature Conservation Reserve, with sections of cleared private property surrounding the remnant vegetation. There's a thin corridor of vegetation connecting the area of remnant vegetation next to Adams Creek Nature Conservation Reserve to the township of Lang Lang. The northeast section has remnant vegetation of the following vegetation types: heathy woodland, herb-rich foothill forest listed as vulnerable, grassy woodland listed as endangered, riparian scrub, which is vulnerable, swampy riparian woodland, endangered, swampy woodland, endangered, and wetland formations, which are also endangered. The threatened status of almost all of the vegetation types in the northeastern section of the corridor really highlights the rarity of this remnant vegetation and how important it is that we protect it. North and west of Lang Lang are the townships of Bales and Kuirup. Along with Adams Creek Nature Conservation Reserve, Bales and Kuirup are hotspots for southern brown bandicoots. There are a high number of bandicoot sightings throughout the Bales and Kuirup areas. Not only are patches of remnant vegetation important for the bandicoots, but corridors are also vital for their survival. By connecting the populations in the Western Port Woodlands area to populations in Bales and Kuirup, we can create a larger meta-population and reduce their chances of local extinction. Despite southern brown bandicoots being highly susceptible to predation by cats and foxes, given the right vegetation, they're able to use thin corridors to move across an otherwise cleared landscape. Research has shown that not only do they use corridors to move through the landscape, they can also live in the corridors as long-term residents. It's vital not only for southern brown bandicoots, but also the many other species living in the Western Port Woodlands Wildlife Corridor that we protect all of the areas of remnant vegetation. However, to protect these species, we not only need to protect remnant vegetation, we also need to revegetate and increase the habitat available to them so we can not only protect their current populations, but increase them. We also need to connect the populations by creating existing and creating new corridors. The northeast section of the Western Port Woodlands corridor provides an important opportunity for not only protecting existing remnant vegetation, but also expanding available habitat and creating new corridors to connect the Western Port Woodlands with other important areas such as Bales and Kuirup. And I will leave it there. So thank you for listening.
I'm actually going to introduce our fifth speaker, and we're going to come back to Gerard very shortly. But I wanted to introduce to you Professor Dick Wetenhall. Dr. Wetenhall is going to be speaking on the use of orchids as a way of illustrating the wonders of the delicately balanced interdependent forest ecosystems and why we need to protect these environmentally precious resources, and also talk about the threats from sand mining as well of Western Port. And so just to give you a bit of an idea about the professor's background. So Professor Wetenhall spent his entire career working as a research biochemist in various Australian and overseas universities. This has led to his appointment as Professor and Head of Biochemistry Department and subsequently as Foundation Director of the Bio21 Institute at the Uni of Melbourne. In relation to environmental protection issues, the specialisation of Bio21 Institute in Chemical and Biochemical Sciences applied to medical and environmental technology, research and development provided him with expertise and insights necessary to assess environmental risks of specific pollutants. Dick's contributions to the Institute included leading the establishment of major high-resolution analytical platform technology facilities of the type needed to detect the toxic chemicals released into the environment from sand mining operations. Following his retirement from the university, he became the owner and operator of the Gerdes Winery, which forms part of the wildlife corridor linking the Gerdes and Hurdy-Gurdy Creek Nature Conservation Reserves. During this period, he developed a specific interest in how beneficiary predators, insects from the nature reserves, could be harnessed to protect grapevines against harmful insects, and in doing so, minimise the need for the use of insecticides. Ooh, okay, over to you, Professor, to share your knowledge with us.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And if I could just acknowledge the first people without going into the details. With not knowing quite what was the best way to contribute to the session, I decided to give you my perspective as someone who lives and breathes the Gerdes Nature Conservation Reserve on a now daily basis since I've shed the winery obligations. All of us who go to the forest, and particularly to the Gerdes Nature Reserve, are sort of there to see nature in one form or another. And for me, the spectacular flora and fauna is overwhelming. And when I see the sand mines in there, it's almost, well, it does sort of effectively bring me to tears to think about the damage that has been done and will be done if it's allowed to continue to expand. Obviously, to symbolise the fauna, the magnificent lace monitor. As a farmer background, I always call them tree goannas. But the lace monitor, I've only seen twice in 10 years of walking the forest. But once you see one, you'll never forget it, and its power and its speed that it moves up the trees, and this sort of almost prehistoric appearance. Of course, the other major sighting is birds, which range through all sorts of species. And to if you like, to epitomise the bird population, all of us who've been to the Dunbabin car park will have been greeted by this little friendly red robin that every time I go there comes and sits on my vehicle, as you can see. So in thinking about what to talk about, I decided to focus on a particular ecosystem within the forest, or a series of ecosystems, which are basically orchid ecosystems, because I think to understand these systems and to appreciate how much damage is being caused by the human interventions, orchids really give you a perspective on all sorts of issues. And really their presence is an indicator of the long-term health of the particular regions where they grow, and is also a reflection of the incredible biodiversity that is being generated within these forests. So pollination really depends on the three different ways that orchids attract insect pollinators. The first one is ways to mimic basically flowers that the insects, such as bees, get their food from, their nectar. And you can see here on the right is one of the native peas, which resembles the orchid on the left, which is the deer donkey orchid that everyone loves to see. And it's the colours that match in the two cases, and the bees get fooled into going to the orchid and imparting a bit of pollen or collecting pollen to take to another orchid. Another example is the waxlip orchid, and I've shown this for two reasons. One is that it also is an example of visual mimicry, but also it introduces the concept of foods-related scents, or some sort of odours that the orchids give off and which attract insects. And you can see that this particular orchid, although it's pollinated by native bees in the main, it attracts a whole variety of other orchids, including the ones that I've shown here that are seen only yesterday with the camera, on the day before actually here. So I don't want to go into the details of the insects, but none of these are actually pollinators, but they come to the orchid because it's attracting them there because of the prospect of food. I just want to comment briefly. You can see the ant that's actually showing its rear end. And I think he must have thought I was a sand miner when I took the photo. Now, food mimicry, which I started with the last slide, this is a mayfly orchid, and you can see that it's pollinated by the insect shown on the right panel, which is a particular form of fungus gnat. And this and some cousin gnats are attracted to this orchid, where they burrow in under you can see there the stamen of the orchid, best visualized in the middle panel. And the the insect, on the way of burrowing in, picks up a bit of that glue, that triangle, clear triangle you can see. And then as it pulls out the pollen, which you can also see there, is wrapped onto the back of the thorax of the insect. And that's how pollen is removed. And if the insect has pollen on it, when it comes, it then just imparts the pollen to the stigma, which is at the back there. Now I want to introduce the third topic, which is sexual cheating, basically. And the concept here is that the orchids emit an odor which is chemically identical to the sex pheromone that the particular species of, in this case, fungus gnats, emit to attract their male partners. And so the orchid makes this scent, which then attracts this insect, in this case, a fungus gnat, and it enters inside the orchid cavity where it tries to copulate on the labellum of the orchid. This is a green hood orchid, and in so doing gets trapped in there, and on its way out picks up pollen, and that's how pollination works. So this is an attempt to illustrate what's going on with another green hood orchid. You can see in the left panel that down in the bottom right, there's an insect that's just landed, and that's another species of fungus gnat. And that, in a few minutes after this photo was taken, flew onto the tongue that you can see hanging down there, the labellum, and then that quickly snaps shut once the insect starts pollinating. And you can see on the right hand where the orchid is showing it's snapped shut because of the insect has triggered it. And you can see the shadow of the insect inside up the top there in the top right. And that's the actual insect trapped inside, now desperately trying to get out. And a series of photos showed that that black shadow moved to the right down towards the beak, and in so doing passes where the pollen is, which is right at the end of that dark blob there. And you can see a slight touch of yellow where the pollen is, and it picks up a bit of glue and then finally picks up pollen and escapes out to take the pollen somewhere else. Now, this is another view of another type of orchid, which is the knotty orchid that everyone loves. And you can see here that the fungus gnats get very keen with this sexual deception. They bring along their female partner as well. And this particular couple were copulating, I think, in midair, and landed on the flower. And once the male is ready, he then moves into the actual flower and gets trapped in there, and on the way out picks up a bit of glue. And if there's no pollen in the flower, in other words, if the flower has already given up all its pollen, the glue is still on the insect when it escapes, as you can see in the right panel. The sexual cheating perhaps is most famously reflected in wasps that pollinate a range of orchids. And here I show the common orchid, the common bird orchid, which is being actually pollinated, has received its male visitor, who is now copulating on the labellum of the orchid. And I've photographed this for over an hour. I've got 40 shots of various aspects of the copulation process going on. Before I leave this slide, I also want to point out that there's a wasp flying past, and this is a closely related species, which is also attracted to this orchid. And this orchid represents a primitive type of orchid that is in evolving its preferences for insects, and produces two types of chemicals. And you can see that here, on the left, that insect has landed on a flower close by, and into the right panel is now taking up the position, the copulation position. And you can see just above the back of the insect is the pollen that it's going to pick up on the way out. So that's those are the three forms of, if you like, pollination, which are important in the life of the orchid. Before leaving the subject of pollination, I want to just spend a minute talking about a major issue in terms of the long-term viability of orchids in our region, and that is that there's a decline in the number of specific insects required. Each orchid has a requirement for a specific species of insect, and there are some that are present in abundance, and there are some that are declining in population. And just as an example, or point on this slide, this is a tall green hood where most of the flowers have been pollinated, and you can see the swollen ovaries in the bottom three flowers. And at the top, you can see that the flower, where the ovary is not expanded, which means it hasn't been pollinated. Now, by using this visual way of assessing pollination, you can make rough estimates. And this year, for example, only about 5% of the nodding green hoods were pollinated, probably a slightly high percentage of the cobras, and I could go on. But the point I'm making is that there is a bit of a crisis going on in terms of loss of habitat, probably a combination of human intervention and climate change. There are other threats to pollinators. This one's obviously a natural threat. You can see the spider web that's connected with the waxlip orchid, and just to the right of that picture, this spider shown was actually coming down the web when I took the picture. And the point is that it sees an insect on the orchid and races down at tremendous speed to try to grab that insect. Another threat are insects which eat the orchids. And this one shows the red spider mite that some of you may be familiar with in gardening context. And this red mite is quite harmful to this mayfly orchid. But the good news is that there are mites, the predator mites, and you can see one on the right-hand screen, which is a different species of mite. And this is what is called a predator mite, and it, along with ladybirds and other predators, attack these harmful insects such as red spider mites. So now I want to move to a different topic, and it's to introduce it. I want to talk briefly about this orchid. It's a hyacinth orchid. You'll notice it's got no leaves, and because it's got no leaves, it can't photosynthesize. In other words, it can't make its own carbon. So where does it get its carbon from? So we now go to the underground. The answer to the question I posed is that the orchid, the hyacinth orchid, and all the other orchids like it that don't have leaves have to get their carbon from the soil. And the carbon nutrients are generated by bacteria, which are organized into sort of quite highly structured microbiological villages underground. And these are accessed by fungal filaments along with oxygen and moisture that can enter through the highly organized architecture of the soil particles. And the fungus then deliver the nutrients to the orchid via specific receptors. Each orchid has its own specific species of fungus that delivers nutrients to that particular orchid. Orchids such as the hyacinth orchid without leaves are totally dependent on these fungal interactions throughout life. And on the other hand, other orchids are also totally dependent during the embryonic development stage. In other words, they cannot get by without these fungal networks that are specific to that particular orchid being underground. And their presence, the whole presence of this remarkable form of adaptation reflects millions of years of evolution. And for me, the absolute tragedy of this is that this all gets blown up, like blowing up housing estates by sand miners. So the sand mines. Now, for those, so this shows the sand mines in the middle of the Gerdes forest. It's about a kilometre walk from anywhere accessible by road, and it's therefore not known to be there by a lot of people. And I've shown this shot of it deliberately to make you realise that it's sitting on right above this beautiful creek valley. And any effluents that leach out of this sand mine will go directly into this valley and start damaging the environment before even getting to Western Port Bay. So to talk about the issues, there's two sand mining issues that I want to sort of get on my soapbox about. First of all, destruction of habitat, and I've already referred to the loss of orchid habitat by destroying the soil systems that they depend on. But the other issue is the pollution of the aquatic environments by chemicals that are used in the washing of sand. And so if sand is washed on site, there's a problem. And because the waste waters go into dredge ponds or into storage ponds, and these contain the highly toxic compounds that are used in the washing process. And these compounds get converted by a process of degradation into highly toxic, acute toxic compounds such as acrylamide and mutagenic compounds such as the nitrosamine that I'll refer to. And once they get into the dredge pond, there's no way of sealing a dredge pond. And so these can leach into groundwater, which can then be discharged into the creek systems and eventually into the Western Port tidal zones. And so once they get into the tidal zone, the real problem that I see, and it's highlighted even in the consultant's report that supporting the sand mining case, is that the groundwater basically enters into the mudflats, most of it, and it goes through the underground aqua systems and is diffused into the mudflats, where it can be basically concentrated to form, to pose risks through mutagenesis in particular to the delicately balanced ecosystems within the mudflats. So the question is what's being done about this? And to my great horror, when looking into the details of, if you like, what provisions that are made to safeguard the environment, not a lot's being done in terms of regulation and government policing of it. And I hope I'm not being too hard on the regulators. But first of all, to ensure best practice, we need to have meaningful environmental impact statements. And to have meaningful impact statements, you must be able to test for the levels of pollutants at the levels where they might cause harm. And this requires analytical instrumentation capable of measuring these pollutants. And in the case of the 2 pollutants that are listed, the sensitivity of the assays have to be able to detect down to 1 trillionth of a part per million, which is a very small amount, obviously. Now, to ensure compliance, to ensure protection of the environment, the government needs to ensure compliance with regulations requiring sand mines to guarantee that the levels of pollutants are not in excess of levels that are safe to the, that are likely to harm the environment. And local companies do offer analytical services, but the sensitivities of their instrumentation is over 100-fold to 1,000-fold less sensitive than is required for ensuring compliance with the international standards for maximum allowable levels of the mutagen NDA, for example, if it's released into the waterways. So to me, best practice is not being realised in this very important area, and particularly because it's just the instrumentation is not being used that's necessary to achieve the sensitivity. There's 2 conclusions that I want to draw your attention to. First of all, I've talked about the ecosystems and their complex interdependencies of plants, insects, and soil microbes which make up these systems, and that these are being irreversibly destroyed, which I think personally is an environmental disaster of considerable dimensions. And then there's the sand mining operations, which, because best practice is not being adhered to, groundwater is being impacted on. This will inevitably be discharged into the precious Western Port wetlands, the Ramsar site, and that there is, because of this, a real risk of serious damage being done to the environment. Now, to be fair, we don't know for a fact that that is going to happen. All we know is chemicals are being released and that we don't know at what levels they're being released. And to me, this is where government needs to be held to account. So thanks very much for the opportunity to get on my soapbox about this.
And it's nice actually to follow Professor Wetnall's examination of the delicacy of the ecosystem, I think, and contrast that to the activities that are taking place by sand miners in the area. So in comparison to those up-close relationships between insects and the orchids and the soil and the fungus, we can contrast what's taking place in these little yellow scars in this landscape. And they may appear small, little nibbles on this screen, but they're actually huge industrial mines that are destroying this precious and delicate habitat right across this landscape, as you can see, even right up to the back doorstep of Granville itself, with these enormous mines, and only a couple of 100 metres from the shoreline of the Ramsar Western Port Bay itself. And it's not just these mines that you can see on the screen that are operational already. the state government has identified this area, as we mentioned back in the 90s, as a huge supply of sand for concrete, for construction. And so the yellow areas on the screen are licensed properties for mining sand. And the red is the broader area where the government has identified that the resource is there and available to be extracted. And there's nothing stopping further sand mines here from buying up properties and applying for licenses to dig more of these holes. And this essentially is the vision that the state government has for this precious ecosystem. Sand, holes in the ground, exposed water table with those processing chemicals that Professor Wetnell mentioned. More sand, look at the destruction that's happening to that very sensitive soil interaction. And what it's really about for the state government is blokes wearing high vis and hard hats building stuff in Melbourne. And just to allay some, some potential concerns or, reasonable counterpoints that, construction is important and the materials to support that are required. This is just one extract from the government commissioned report on supply of extractive resources, many different, different types of rock and what have you that are used. You can see at the bottom of the table is sand and gravel, and I've done the sums for those that are trying to compute it in their head. The demand that they're expecting over the next 30 odd years, and the supply of sand in licensed reserves, and what that equals is more than 500 years worth of supply in licensed reserves now. So what that means is that we really don't have to destroy sensitive habitat in an area that is already heavily cleared. This is the message that we're trying to send loud and clear to the state government to shift their sights on other places that are not so precious and in short supply. The habitat is in much shorter supply than the sand. And one of the opportunities that we have as a community to send this message to the state government is the statement of planning policy that is underway at the moment, and we're expecting their draft report imminently. This is the Bass Coast Distinctive Areas and Landscapes Planning Policy, which is the umbrella policy that sits over the planning regulation for the next 50 years. And this is what deals with land use conflicts, essentially. So settlement boundaries, coastal settlements, and of course, importantly in this that we're talking about now is the environment and extractive industries. And this is one, I've done this work, but you can expect this to be in their draft report. This is the Victorian government's strategic biodiversity values mapped alongside the sand mining work authorities and the interest area that I showed earlier. And what you can see is in that corridor, which is one of the very few places in the area that holds biodiversity value, is directly overlaid by this sand mining, which is obvious to us, but hasn't been dealt with as a planning conflict. So I'll just take this opportunity to encourage everyone to take part in responding to that draft plan. We're able to make submissions, and our group, Save Western Port Woodlands, will be providing information and templates, etc., support for individuals to make these submissions, so everyone can feel supported when it comes out, which we're expecting in the next was supposed to be 2 months ago, so it could be any time, and expect it to be within the next month. We'll only have 2 to 4 weeks to respond meaningfully to this, so we'll be ready. And if you are on the mailing list, then you'll be provided with information. If you're not, join the mailing list, and we'll keep you updated so we can get in there and make our voices heard. And what we really want to do is send, provide the government with an alternative vision for what we feel this patch of the earth could be, instead of an industrial, mining area. And, if you visited, this is what you'll remember. If you haven't, this is what awaits for you. And we look forward to you coming down. Hopefully you're not trapped by lockdown, but it waits for you when lockdown disappears. This is the shoreline of Grantville, which neighbours the woodlands, and there are connectivities of the habitat. There's a few disruptions, but it's quite interlinked. And it's very important that these very different types of habitat remain connected, because that's what builds the resilience and biodiversity that is so important for these little guys, big guys really, the powerful owl. Lace monitor, as Dick mentioned, another threatened species of the area. Swift parrot, which is a frequent visitor, that's also threatened. And many others that has been identified in this great report that we're looking forward to sharing with everybody. And of course, it's not just important for the animals. Of course, that's flora and fauna and the diverse habitats. But it's really important for us as well, because we love this place and want to make sure that it remains lovely into the future. And so this is sort of our rough vision for this corridor, that it can be a somewhat contiguous, interconnected conservation reserve. Now it's got some housing and some other land uses that make that complicated, but not impossible to achieve. An interconnected reserve system with private property and public lands playing their part. So here, this is what's already Crown land, public owned land in the corridor. And some of that public land has been made available for sand mining in some of the most rich conservation reserves in the region, which must stop. But the fact that there is so much public land there is a great starting point for making this reserve system. And there's the shoreline of Western Port itself, all the way to the Bass River, and creeks and valleys and hillsides in between that make such a diverse ecosystem possible. Being a rural area, the public land in between, there's actually not that many privately held properties that are necessary to play a bit of a part here to make an effective contiguous park reserve system. A lot of them have really intact native vegetation on them already, and obviously the big one that stands out is the proving ground property, which is enormous and really high quality bushland, and just happens to be for sale right now. So we're really on the front foot now, advocating with the local government and the state government to do what we can to make sure that this opportunity doesn't slip through our fingers to protect this property. And what else is within this corridor? There are more beyond the arbitrary boundary that I've drawn on the map here, but the yellow here is sand mine work authorities. A lot of them already have done their damage by removing the topsoil, and they keep digging down. But on a longer term vision, we've got some short-term actions, but also in the longer term, there is an opportunity to reserve these land parcels as future conservation areas through revegetation and rehabilitation. We won't probably be around to see them in their, full glory, but if we do the work now, then we can ensure that they're available to play that part a long way down the track. Which incidentally was the original plan when mining in the area was hatched as an idea back in the 90s. You can see here on the map, it was intended that the mining in the area, in the words of the report, to have no net loss of Indigenous vegetation at final rehabilitation compared with the date of approval for extraction. Now, this is the intentions of the plan, and it's up to us to ensure that the miners are held responsible for following through on this commitment. And part of this, this exercise is to reach out to the community, especially the local community that knows this place really well, to get in touch with us so we can really put together a vision of what this reserve system could be. There's a lot of features throughout this area. There's the Western Port shoreline itself, which connects to the woodlands through the foreshore reserves. There's the Grantville Reserve in the south with just the most spectacular grass tree forest you'll ever see. There is the Gerties, which is an orchid, a famous orchid reserve. There's a rail trail through there. I mean, there is lots of diversity. There's the Bass River here, and we want to showcase, what this could be, because it's just not really known at the moment, apart from those who are familiar with the area. So please do reach out if you've got some ideas of some little known gems in there, so we can point them out. And I just also want to really quickly show that, there is a lot of conflict here with with a sand resource and conservation, but there is so much sand outside of this area, even locally. This is not just somewhere else's problem, but even locally, there are less critical parcels of land that have huge piles of sand that could be explored, that don't need to dig it straight out of sensitive habitat. So this is us. We're just people from the local area that are trying to protect what's there before it's gone. And we're very open. We love hearing from anyone else in the area or further afield that has a passion for this place and getting you involved in the campaign. We're very active. We meet weekly, and there's lots you can do. You can start by joining our mailing list, join the team. You can come along for one of these great photo shoots. You can, if you don't have the time, you can donate to the cause and our fighting fund. Please write a submission for the distinctive areas and landscapes. Watch the videos about the place and share them with your friends and family. If you own one of the properties that interconnect this area, or know someone that does, that might be receptive to protections, let us know. We'll get in touch and share with us your ideas for the place, because we love to pull them all together into a great vision, an alternative vision for what this place could be. And that's it from me. Thanks for the time.
Thanks, Gerard, for sharing your passion with us and all your incredible work on this campaign for this really special area. We are at 8 o'clock and we've just we're a little bit over time, so we still do have a Q&A, which we're going to keep really, really short and answer probably only a really small number of questions tonight. So if we can, for those of you who have to go, that's totally fine. We understand. Yeah, if you can stick around for another like 5 minutes potentially, that would be ace. But the recording, the webinar has also been recorded as well, which we'll send that around tomorrow. It would be remiss of us to, I guess, to talk about these threats as well and not have anything that you can do to help. And so Gerard's mentioned a few websites, links to his website with some actions that they've got going on as well. We also wanted to let you know that we have just launched an action as of tonight, which, and as Gerard was saying, and Jordan earlier tonight, about the Holden Proving Ground and how it is the largest and most intact remnant woodland and sort of, the largest, I guess, area that we have an opportunity in this whole region here at the moment to actually do something really good with that. And because it's up for sale, we've got an action to ask the Victorian Environment Minister, Lily D'Ambrosio, for the Victorian government to actually purchase the proving ground to protect Western Port Woodlands from industrial sand mining. So the link is going to be put in the chat. So please take action and share that far and wide if you can. And also just a reminder that if you do want to see the report or get your own copy, please head to the webpage to do that as well. And yeah, thanks again to Save Western Port Woodlands Group for your support with that and all the other folks that were involved. The link for the report will also be in the chat. So Q&A time. We're just going to keep this really, really short. So some questions have come through already. If we don't get to all of your questions, we will take them on board and attempt to answer them as well. So just a quick note is that the Professor Wettenhall and Megan, if you've got questions for those, we will just take them and pass them on. So please, direct your questions for Jordan, Matt, Gerard, and have I forgotten anyone? No, I think that's it. All right, so we had a couple of questions that came through earlier. So this one's from Steve Meacher. Do we know the asking price of the site? So Jordan or Gerard, can either of you answer that one?
You want to go, Gerard?
We don't know what they're asking this time around. It's been a bit of a closed discussion so far. We know that the original, well, it was sold just a year ago from Holden to a company called VinFast, and they're selling it on. Last time it sold for around $30 million. And so there's the property, there's a lot of infrastructure for an automotive proving ground, which is where a lot of the value lies. So there's possibly potential to split, the bush at the back from a valuable test facility at the front.
Great, thank you. And then we have a question from Tony. I'm not sure, probably either of you as well to answer this one, but what conversations have taken place with local councils and what was the result?
We've been in touch with council, constantly actually, since the proving ground was first put up a year ago. Various things have been taking place. In relation to the proving ground being up for sale again now, we have been in touch with the council, and they've been investigating, as far as I know, opportunities for placing overlays on the property or considering zoning, because everything there is just farm zone, which is quite unrestricted use of that area. So that's one opportunity to intervene before it changes hands. And there's still dialogue in between the state government and Bass Coast Council, so far as I know.
Great. Jordan, did you have anything to add, or?
We'll be sending, so the whole corridor is covered by 3 Cairnsville, South Gippsland, Cardinia, and the Bass Coast. And they'll all be getting beautiful hard copies of the report.
Yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so we have a question from Julia. Have you tried to letterbox drop the key properties in the area? Did someone
Not yet.
Yeah.
That is something that we'll be doing shortly.
Yeah. Great. Then we have a question from Julie. Is there much support locally for the sand mine expansion?
I think that there's pockets of support for sand mining. I'm not sure about further expansion. I mean, there's people there that are employed and they don't like having fingers waggled at them, which is understandable. But there is a difference between these industries doing what they do and destroying a sensitive woodland. And so we think that there doesn't have to be a conflict, there just happens to be one at the moment.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to make this the last question, and it's from Mike. Is what remediation is required by quarry operators?
Should I answer this, or could I answer this?
Please.
I think the best way to answer it is to refer to international best practice. And if we take Wisconsin, for example, the equivalent of dredge ponds in the very intense sand mining areas there are required to be sealed. Now, that basically means you can't use them as dredge ponds. In other words, you can't release waste waters into porous ponds that can leach into groundwater. So what the mining industry should be asked to do is to only put waste from washing sand into sealed, that is non-porous storage ponds or settling ponds.
And if I could just add to that, besides the water handling, there's also, deep, extensive scars in the surface of the earth in these places. And, we know that it's not realistic that the full glory of biodiversity it's not possible to bring that back through revegetation and rehabilitation. Typically what they do is try and stabilize the area so they're not responsible for landslides in the future. That's the primary thing that they do. And then they cover it with they replant some native trees and shrubs on the top, which, I mean, we should be advocating that they do a much better job of that than what they will do if they don't have someone bearing down their necks.
Yep. So that's, I guess got to keep them in check, huh?
Yeah, and so I mean, some of these properties formerly were farmland, which is not exactly rich ecosystems, and over a long view of things, having them dedicated to conservation over a very long term, which could, reintroduce some biodiversity. We're talking hundreds and thousands of years over the long term. That could be positive instead of it just being more pasture, which there's no shortage of in the area. So that's, I wouldn't say that's our best tactic to go and dig it up and then replant, but it's an opportunity for us considering what's taking place.
Yeah. Well, great. Thanks, Gerard and Richard, for answering that question. Richard, there's a few more about orchids, but we will pass them on to you. And for all of those questions we did not get to, which there wasn't that too many that we didn't get to, thank you all. And we will endeavour to get back to you separately. But yeah, I'm going to close the evening now because it's 10 minutes over time, but just wanted to, thank you all for coming tonight. Join us on your Wednesday evening to hear about this special place. We'll be sending an email around tomorrow with links you know, in case you've missed any of them tonight, and a copy of the report as well. But yeah, please follow from all of the groups you've heard from tonight. Please continue to follow their important work to find out how you can get involved and help protect this special place. And thank you so much to all of our guest speakers, to all of you for your time tonight, Jared, Richard, Megan, Jordan and Matt. And thank you all for coming, and we'll see you on the flip side.